Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Trade Justice Alliance Sunday night webinar. We're having a webinar tonight, June 10th, 2018. Tonight's title is Nafta 2.0, The Devil is in the Details. Our guest speakers tonight are William Waren. He's a senior trade analyst with Friends of the Earth U.S. Bill will speak about the likely impacts the Trump trade team would have on a modernized Nafta. And Harvey, a new national field director with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, will energize and activate us with the campaign to replace Nafta with trade that works for people and planet. Since Nafta was signed into law about 25 years ago, the environment has suffered greatly through the expansion of fossil fuels, pipeline projects, fracking, tar sands, and the deregulations of toxics that affect water, air, food, and human health. In my own state of Florida, for example, the Sabal Trail pipeline was gouged right through the center of our fragile aquifer, and most of the gas is going to be shipped out of the country for export. If the state of Florida approved a fracking ban, we would be vulnerable to a lawsuit under the investor-state dispute settlement provision in NAFTA's Chapter 11. The Investor-State Dispute Settlement Chapter is at the heart of numerous suits by corporations against countries attempting to regulate pollution and slow down climate chaos through public interest regulations. And there are other equally awful binding aspects of NAFTA and other free trade agreements also. And tonight we will hear about some of those additions tonight and strategies also to organize for better policies. I'm just going to go over a couple details right now very quickly. If you're in phone only and you would like to enjoy the meeting room, just go to tradejustice.net/webinar. Put your name in the highlighted user field and press enter. We use phone for audio, and that is the situation we're in currently, though that will be changing soon, as soon as we overcome our fear of a new technology. In the meantime, if you want to use the soft phone, which is free of charge, just go to freeconferencecallhd.com/dialer and enter the dial-in number with access code into the on-screen keypad. There you'll have audio over your computer free of charge. Just be sure to turn on your computer's speakers. Please visit our tradejustice.net website and join our Facebook group at Trade Justice Alliance. We only have one rule for our chat box, and that is to please be respectful of our wonderful guest speakers and our attendees. My name is Harriet Haywood. I'm an organizer with People Demanding Action, and I'm a coordinator with the Trade Justice Alliance Working Group. And lastly, to opt in to receive text reminders for future webinars, just text from your cell phone in all caps, webinar reminder with no spaces, all one word to 917-791-1131. And now I would like to introduce our first guest speaker, our friend William Waren. I just wanted to give a little mention here that Bill's expertise is something that we rely on regularly to educate us about the effects of trade deals on the health of people and the planet. Bill Waren is a senior trade analyst at Friends of the Earth. He works to protect the environment from the negative impacts of international trade and investment agreements. Bill's research, writings, and advocacy have focused on trade deals such as the TPP, TTIP, NAFTA, and TISA, as well as on litigation under existing trade and investment agreements. Prior to joining Friends of the Earth, Bill served as policy director at the Forum on Democracy and Trade and as a senior fellow at the Harrison Institute for Public Law at Georgetown University Law Center. A native of rural downstate Illinois, Bill took a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and a Master's of Arts in Public Administration at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He also has a JD from Duke Law School and a Master's of Law in Public Interest Advocacy at Georgetown Law. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you very much. It's very clear to me and to all of us at Friends of the Earth that Donald Trump's rhetoric and action more than strongly suggest that he plans to use a new rewritten Nafta deal to step up his war on the planet. Trump's Nafta redo is highly likely to reflect many of the elements of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, and specifically the portions of the TPP that undercut environmental regulations. Unlike international environmental agreements, or indeed most international agreements, trade deals like the TPP and Nafta can be effectively enforced by provisions providing for international lawsuits before trade tribunals and provisions providing for international regulatory review and rollback. The Trump administration's NAFTA negotiating objectives make clear that Trump plans to use a new NAFTA to hamstring effective environmental regulation across the board, and furthermore, to use NAFTA to accelerate fossil fuel production, export, and trade. And I particularly want to emphasize that Trump's NAFTA threatens new and existing regulatory safeguards in areas such as chemical safety, food safety, biotechnology, pesticide safety, sustainable agriculture, green standards for public purchasing, and global warming. Let me just tick off 9 ways in which Trump's NAFTA deal endangers the planet. 1, even if a new NAFTA allows the U.S. to opt out of the jurisdiction of international investment tribunals, and that's uncertain at this point, clearly regular trade tribunals would still...
Bill, are you on, I'm not sure which slide to put it on right now. Are you watching?
Under regulatory review?
I'm on the okay, thank you.
Yeah. They can be effectively enforced in government-to-government lawsuits before international panels of trade lawyers that are biased toward corporations. These panels have the authority to impose retaliatory trade sanctions such as higher tariffs, if not money damages, on exports of countries that fail to roll back regulation. This process presents a serious threat to sensible environmental and climate policies. I would particularly focus on NAFTA's regulatory review provisions, which creates institutions and procedures for blocking the promulgation of new environmental and other public interest regulations, and indeed even rolling back existing regulations. In some kind of a regulatory review process or regulatory review institution seems clearly to be in the offing in Trump's new NAFTA. In some ways, this could be thought of as an international version of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, as it's called inside the Beltway. This office was created by Ronald Reagan, and it is proven to be a very effective way of delaying and blocking federal agency regulations in the United States, particularly when it comes to the environment and public health. A new NAFTA regulatory review process could also establish inappropriate procedures for mutual recognition of safety standards and a bureaucratic process for identifying alleged excessive burdens on business. And again, this would slow down or stop promulgation of environmental, climate, health, and other public interest regulations. Among other negative consequences, regulatory review provisions could encourage the inappropriate use of business-friendly cost-benefit analysis that would hamstring public interest safeguards. The process inherently gives disproportionate weight to quantitative data and economic costs while diminishing the perceived importance of qualitative benefits such as saving lives, maintaining the equilibrium of the global ecosystem, and protecting wild places. Now I'd like to focus on some of the more specific threats that are facing us, starting with chemical safety standards. NAFTA 2.0 threatens the deregulation of chemical safety standards. It could result in the rollback of effective regulations put in place by California and some other jurisdictions related to chemicals associated with, for example, breast cancer, infertility, and other illnesses. And it could also block future reforms at the national level, and those reforms are desperately needed. If you compare the regulatory, or the chemical safety standards that are applied by the European Union, they clearly adhere to the precautionary principle that the chemical companies, the other corporations, have a burden of proof to show that their product is safe, rather than putting the burden of proof on those who are concerned about the unintended consequences. Next, I'd highlight that NAFTA puts family farms at risk. I think we got another slide there.
Okay.
A new NAFTA deal is certain to increase the volatility of agricultural markets, putting family farms at risk and increasing corporate control of agriculture. And what we've seen under the existing NAFTA is that literally tens of millions of small family farmers in Mexico were driven off the land. I mean, that's the reason why many of them went, illegally over the Rio Grande to make money in the United States to feed their families. But these good people were displaced from the land when there were massive subsidized exports of agricultural products coming down from the United States. Furthermore, it increases the risk to sustainable family farms in the United States as well, because if you get into the naughty details of these provisions, they're clearly intended to benefit Cargill and Monsanto and all the other big corporate agricultural enterprises. And this is a very, very serious issue. Next, I would highlight that NAFTA threatens prudent food safety regulations. Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, a renegotiated NAFTA is almost certain to give foreign food exporters greater powers to challenge border inspections, as well as authorize attacks on food safety standards before trade tribunals. The deal could also very well substitute private food safety certifications for government inspections in many cases. In other words, the fox would be guarding the hen house rather than an independent body guarding the public health. The fifth issue I would like to highlight is that NAFTA is very likely, indeed almost certain, to encourage the irresponsible use of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and the even more frightening technology of synthetic biology. A renegotiated NAFTA deal is likely to build in protections for biotechnology and genetically modified organisms. NAFTA countries are likely to be obliged to quickly approve GMO crops and products, and GMO labeling requirements at the state or local level are likely to be put at severe risk. Significant patent protections are also almost certain to be given to biotech seed companies. And this is really not only is it bad for the environment, but it gives big agricultural corporations like Monsanto the capacity to collect monopoly rents because of their intellectual property control of biotech seeds. Next issue that I would highlight is that NAFTA threatens bees in our food supply. Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a revised NAFTA is likely to thwart efforts to stop the use of bee-killing neonicotinoid, it's hard to pronounce, neonic pesticides. These neonics are a leading cause of bee declines, a threat to the crops that depend on bees for pollination. And of course, it's a threat to the ecosystem as a whole, because bees are enormously important in terms of facilitating pollination of plants. And these pesticides are killing off the bees, and this promises an environmental and ecological disaster. And I really would like to emphasize this. The next issue I want to highlight is that NAFTA threatens green standards for public purchasing. We don't have a whole lot of information on what the green purchasing requirements in the new NAFTA are going to look like, but it seems likely that they will ensure that any preference given to goods and services with the low environmental impacts in the procurement process will be off limits. Finally, I would emphasize that NAFTA threatens sound climate policy. A new deal on NAFTA will likely ramp up global warming by increasing coal, oil, and gas exports. Such free trade and dirty energy projects would accelerate climate change across North America and around the world. Currently, NAFTA's energy chapter limits Canada's ability to restrict production of fossil fuels, such as tar sands oil from Alberta. This provision should be eliminated. It's hard to believe that climate change denier Donald Trump will go along with that. Other NAFTA rules allow renewable portfolio standards, low-carbon fuel standards, and other climate-friendly energy regulations to be challenged for impeding the business and the profits of foreign fossil fuel firms. And we've seen that Donald Trump is the world's foremost climate denier, and he's not going to fix this problem. He's going to ramp up global warming. I should also say that new NAFTA ideally would include new climate protections, for example, penalizing imported goods with high climate emissions. Again, I cannot imagine Donald Trump accepting this very reasonable environmental provision in the new NAFTA deal. And instead, I think that what we're going to see is a comprehensive and across-the-board rollback of climate and other essential environmental and public health regulations. And a lot of this is included in some of the more technical chapters of NAFTA that don't get talked about as much. So chapters on technical barriers to trade, or sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or regulatory review, and so on down the list. But I think that we need to shine a spotlight on these provisions, because regulatory rollback, especially as it impacts the environment, I see it as the most overwhelming threat presented by Trump's new NAFTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That's a lot of information. If you all have a question for Bill, please press *6, and then you will be prompted to press 1, and then you'll be put into the queue. I think it's just terrible that nobody can see the agreement. You know, we're just basically going on what they choose to tell us about it. It's terrible.
That's true, but we know very clearly what Donald Trump's anti-environment and anti-climate agenda is. And
that's right.
There's been no indication.
And I know I read that the Cato Institute was really pushing the regulatory review, and they just thought NAFTA was wonderful, that it was a corporate trade agreement and an investor agreement that's enforceable. They just thought that was terrific, that we had those things all rolled up into one. So it's really terrible.
And the big corporations and Wall Street are a little bit nervous about some of Trump's ideas and renegotiating NAFTA, but they're clearly enthusiastic about these regulatory chapters or these deregulatory chapters. And this is a story that is not being told. We need to really get the message out on this. That said, it's difficult because these are some of the most technical provisions of the agreement.
The regulatory review is something that nobody ever talks about, and yet, it seems to me that the regulatory review chapter, if they were to get rid of the ISDS, and it seems to me that the regulatory review would kind of, swing into, being more important. And I'm not sure what the legal ramifications.
You still have the trade tribunals there, which can effectively enforce the regulatory review provisions and the regulatory review. But also the regulatory review provisions characteristically establish institutions and procedures for stopping good public interest regulations before they can even be offered to the public or considered by federal or state agencies.
It's really scary to me. That we have these corporate infrastructure, that we have no control over, and our laws are beneath what they do because technically it's a treaty. So, do we have anybody in the queue yet for a question for Bill?
We do. We have 2 in the queue.
3.
I'm sorry. Hold on just a second here. My whole box resituated itself. Okay, here we go. Caller at 206 area code, your line is open.
Hi, this is Sheldon Prentice in Seattle. I think you maybe somewhat answered this already, but maybe you could clarify. Have you seen a lot of these provisions, or is your analysis based on your understanding of who our president is, which I understand? But because I'm pretty familiar with what was in the TPP, and as you say, a lot of these things sound very similar to the TPP, but I don't think they were a lot of the provisions you're talking about in the current NAFTA, or these are things you have seen that are expected to be added. And then maybe part 2, if it's okay to have a part 2. Right now it seems as though things are not going well for the president with regard to Canada. So I'm wondering where you see things standing with regard to the likelihood of their getting an agreement anytime soon. So thanks.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of experience not only with the TPP, but even more so in the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the European Union, which included a lot of sweeping attacks on the institutional capacity of governments to issue regulations. And while the text is secret and we don't have any legal language to parse, we've seen the wish list of the big corporations in terms of their Federal Register comments, and we see their public comments to the effect that they're quite satisfied with the provisions in this area, or at least that's what their press reports say. Now, we don't have a lot of detail because this has been the most secret and behind the curtains negotiations we've ever met. But we do know that the corporations are happy, and we do know what Trump's record is when it comes to environmental regulation. He's the deregulator in chief.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Eldon.
Okay. Our next speaker is caller at area code 815. Your line is open. Hello? 815.
Yes, I'm here.
There you are.
I'm here. Sorry, I muted myself and forgot.
That's okay.
Okay, regarding family funds at risk, what about the growing desire of people to eat organic food? Are we just going to be lost, or will that sort of help the small farmers stay in business? And I also had another question, sort of like the other person who just asked theirs. Are Mexico and Canada going to be so willing to just fall in behind us and just do what we want? Didn't Trudeau just get a big, I don't know, raking over the coals by the people of Canada for buying part of the pipeline or something? That's it. That's my questions, two of them.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.
Okay, could you repeat the first question for me again to make sure I've got it?
Sure. What about the growing desire of people to eat organic food?
Yeah.
Will that help the small farmers stay in business or not?
Well, clearly, more farmers, small farmers particularly, are getting in the organic movement, sustainable agriculture, locally grown food, that is produced in environmentally sustainable ways, and also reinforces rural economies. But the provisions in the new NAFTA appear to be largely formulated by the big agribusiness companies who have a long track record of attacking organic standards, organic labeling incentives, and other very, very sensible provisions. So I think that organics are at severe risk.
Great. Thank you.
And in terms of whether we're going to get a deal out of this, Justin Trudeau was really ready to cut a deal until Donald Trump sort of went off the deep end and began insulting him in Quebec over the weekend. But we'll just have to see whether they have a successful negotiation or not. And I can't predict what Donald Trump is going to do. I don't think Donald Trump knows what he's going to do. That a lot of his behavior is random and impulsive.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question comes from Miss Wendy. Your line is open.
Hello. Thank you, ladies, and thank you, everybody, for being on the call. My question is for those of us who have governors that are saying they're going to have no fracking, they're going to a green economy and a green sustainable plan and renewable energy with the ISDS and the regulatory provisions. Essentially, they're kind of just lying to us, as well as they're bringing in the infrastructure that is leading to export, as Harriet exclaimed. And how, my question is, how do we approach them and challenge them now as we know that the trade, the health, the environment, and even the internet all connect? Thank you.
Well, I think it's very important for people to call, write, and meet with your members of Congress, because there won't be any persuading of Donald Trump or Trade Representative Lighthizer on a strong environmental agenda. Lighthizer might be a little bit more sympathetic to some of the labor unions' concerns, although I don't think that's a sure thing necessarily. And he's a bit more of a national sovereignty person who's, sometimes skeptical about international institutions. But there's absolutely nothing in his background or in any communications that he has issued that suggests that he's in the least bit concerned about environmental safeguards and maintaining a robust regulatory state generally. He's a very conservative Republican. He used to be a top staff guy for Bob Dole. He's not quite as extreme as some of the other people in the Trump administration, but there's no question that he's close to many of the big agricultural corporations.
And most of our congressmen seem to be acting in a fashion of corporate centrist behavior as well, without any action We got the Senate numbers for net neutrality, for example, and the Congress does nothing. The same, with the pipeline issues. We ask of our senators to support local projects that keep our water clean, our rivers environmentally. The DRBC decision coming down on June 13th, but we get nowhere with the Congress members.
Well, that's why it's very important to support people who are challenging current members of Congress, and it's also a reason just to redouble your efforts and try to establish a relationship with the incumbent. Those are not mutually exclusive tactics, because the threat of support for a challenger and communication of our message go hand in hand. I mean, I'm at the same time, I recognize that this is not easy, because the big corporations buy and sell members of Congress like some kind of commodity. But if we don't resist it, it's just going to go unimpeded in the future. And
that's my name. It's Wendy gets it. I get it.
We have to be in a long fight on this, and we can't give up. It's going to be tough, but the cause is urgent.
Well, I threw my name on the ballot to challenge my congressman, because this incumbent just literally runs away from me. And I've gone to the office. I've made all the phone calls. I've, held the protest outside. But, so my name will be on it. Wendy gets it. So thank you so much for all of your work. And I really rely on your statistics and analytical brains and expertise. And thank you. I'll bring all the information forward.
Well, I rely on people like you who care enough to, take action at the state and local level, because that's how you really affect change. It's not going to be because you're cozy to powers that be on Capitol Hill. It means that you're putting pressure on in the district and at the state level.
Thank you. I truly believe that trade, health, environment, and net are really important, and that the dots all connect. And when we're demanding the justice and equality in those four areas, I know other folks, Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, say focus on one area, and that may be good. But I think in these times, if we're grouping together spokes of the wheel as we challenge ourselves in our own education and action, that seemed to help me. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for your commitment.
Thanks, Wendy.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Our next question comes from the area code 718. Your line is open.
Susan Metz from the Park Slope Food Co-op, 17,000 members, International Trade Education Squad. We're getting appointments with our electeds, and this coming Tuesday we're going to have a conversation into which all this will come. We need somebody to come to Brooklyn to help us to bring this message as I have the notes, but I talk too much anyway, so we want somebody in another haircut. Okay. On next Tuesday, the 19th, in Brooklyn. Anybody who has a contact, please let us know. I have two questions, because we are the largest consumer cooperative in the country. And are we going to be able to screen for GMOs? Are we going to be able to fulfill our mission, which says we favor locally produced products? Or is this deregulation reach down as far into our practice, please?
Well, again, we don't have legal text because of the secrecy, but there's all the evidence strongly suggests that your cooperative and other such wonderful efforts across the country are at risk, at severe risk. Just if you look and see how pleased the international food and agricultural companies are with those provisions of the Trump deal, I expect the worst.
Thanks.
We need to release the tax campaign like we ran on the TPP, on the Nafta.
Well, we're going to go into all our elected officials, state, city, and we have the feds during recess. We're looking for time with them. The ISDS affects every level of government with regulation, and that has to come out to all the elected officials on every level that their work is bullshit unless we can get that out of the treaty.
That's right.
If I could add, however, it is possible that ISDS will be significantly watered down by Trump. The U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer doesn't like it, not because of legitimate reasons, but because he's a rabid American nationalist, and he distrusts international institutions that might dictate to the United States. But there will still be trade tribunals and a regulatory review process, 99% certain, and that's can be just as big a threat as ISDS.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, we have one more question in our queue. Area code 607, your line is open.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Bill, for doing this. You talked about action at the state level, which is true, certainly where things are more likely to help with the climate preservation in blue states. But couldn't everyone on a national scale coordinate in the process of preserving the climate as we have it more or less now and slow down climate change just from personal consumption? In terms of not buying new stuff, could there be a strategy where sort of out of desperation people could sort of figure out if you undermine the economy, it's going to look bad on Trump, he's less likely to get reelected, and at the same time, if we buy less new stuff that we don't need, or stuff that we want rather than what we need, which has to be new, but is there a way to sort of use our habits, the habits formed from corporate advertising telling us we need to buy? Could there be a anti-Trump resistance strategy that would help the climate by just buying less stuff, sort of a consumer boycott? Do you think that's a part of what might help save this from being too late, having Trump in control and in power, and knowing that the federal government's just not going to be doing anything until he's out of office?
I think you're absolutely right. The question is whether there are going to be any consumer choices once these trade agreements go into effect. I mean, it presumes that you can buy organic and that you'll have some labels that assure you that it is in fact organic, for example. And there are a variety of ways of labeling products as environmentally sustainable when in fact they're not. So I certainly applaud using the consumer choice as a tool, but it needs to be married with political action.
Thank you. Yep.
Caller at area code 847, your line is open.
Hi, this is Mary Shusgreen from Illinois. Was Justin Trudeau really ready to go along with this nightmare? And was the President of Mexico ready to go along with this nightmare? What you have described, Bill, is quite frightening, quite alarming. If the climate is if we're going to end up as a scorched cinder, can't we depend on somebody in this process to have common sense, like the leaders of other countries, and say no to Donald Trump?
Well, the President of Mexico and Trudeau in Canada are resisting Trump on some of the things he's seeking in NAFTA, but they both have terrible records on the climate in particular. Trudeau just literally nationalized pipeline to take tar sands oil from Alberta to the Puget Sound because it is no longer a viable commercial enterprise. So the government of Canada is literally going to nationalize and fund the building of this awful tar sands oil pipeline. And of course, it not only increases global warming, but presents an immediate threat to the pristine ecological environment, in the Puget Sound, the waters and the sea life and so forth. And the so-called Party of Institutional Revolution in Mexico is notoriously corrupt.
Yes.
One of the things that they've done under Nafta is to lower their environmental and pollution standards in order to attract U.S. companies to particularly northern Mexico, so they can export back into the United States and then sell at a lower price than U.S. companies can offer because they have to comply with environmental and health regulations. We may be getting a new and more progressive president of Mexico soon. The election's coming up in July, but he doesn't actually take office until, I believe, January of 2019. So, and Trudeau is very clever. I mean, he sort of packages himself as a progressive, but he's not.
So I hope somebody will tell us how we fight this thing, because I'm scared.
Well, Congress is the way to get to people. You have to work numbers in Congress.
That's the second half of the call tonight. We have a speaker from Global Trade Watch with a bunch of stuff that we're going to be able to do. So,
okay,
stick with us and get active.
Okay, folks, so we do have one more questioner if there's time for that. Miss Mara. Mara, your line is open.
Hi, this is Mara. I just wanted to comment on regulations, alleged environmental regulations about livestock and farm animals, and that is that I've been discovering more and more lately about cage-free and poultry porches, and the meaning of what you get when you get animals that have been humanely raised, allegedly, and it's horrifying. The animals that can peck their way, they do have beaks, some of them, to the porch, get a breath of air. It's not so fresh because it's on a poultry farm, but it's horrendous, and these kind of regulations are already supposedly, some of them, tell me if I'm wrong, Bill, but under the WTO there are some regulations that impact false advertising, and there was, I think that there are some regulations in place, and the United States government has some that are allegedly in place, and they just don't mean anything.
Well, I'm familiar with especially state and local regulations that have been at least somewhat helpful. I'm not sure that the federal regulation has been very effective, and the whole paradigm for these trade agreements, going back to the original NAFTA and the World Trade Organization agreement, is to establish institutions and procedures to roll back public interest regulations, in particular targeting of environmental and health and animal safety regulations. So, I think that the situation is dire.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mara. That was a great question too. Thank you so much, Bill. We really do look forward to you coming on to our webinars. It's always a great pleasure and an honor, and we hope you will join us in the future. If you'd like to stick with us and participate in the chat, please do that. And in the meantime, we'll check you out on Facebook and in your emails. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I will keep my big mouth shut for the rest of the program, but I will be listening attentively.
Thanks. You so much, Bill. Thanks. Okay, let's move on down the line here. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Ryan Harvey. He is a National Field Director with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Ryan comes to Public Citizens Global Trade Watch with 20 years of experience in grassroots organizing, arts activism, and independent journalism. He is a musician, an amazing folk musician and songwriter, label manager, and public speaker. Ryan carries a deep understanding of global politics that is evident in his music and his writings and in his videos, as well as in his creative styles of organizing. He co-founded several organizations, including the Riot Folk Collective in 2004, the Anti-War Civilian Soldier Alliance in 2006, Firebrand Records 2015, and Rebel Lens in 2017. Ryan Harvey resides in his hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome, Ryan. Your line
Thanks.
hopefully is open.
Yes.
Okay,
cool.
Beautiful. Okay, thanks.
All right. Hey, everybody. So I'm not seeing the slides starting. Is that my computer stalling? Or?
No, they're starting. I'm not sure what's going on with your.
I'll re-enter the room real quick. But in the
Okay,
meantime,
sure.
thanks for having me, everybody, and bear with me. This is I'm new to Global Trade Watch. I'm not new to trade justice organizing. There we go. It's working now. This is my first time giving this talk and presentation. Also, as Bill alluded to, and as everyone knows, it's a really freaking bizarre time period. So I think every day is a new day. So if I say something that has been discredited on Twitter today, feel free to inform me of that. So here's what I'm going to talk about is what we're doing right now at Global Trade Watch, and also with our partner groups through the Replace Nafta campaign. And I also want to talk about some, general ideas about what we should be doing and what we are doing. The first thing to know from our vantage point, and as folks know, well, here's my goals. So just to give you a quick table of contents, I just want to talk a little bit about what's been happening inside of the NAFTA renegotiations from our perspective, which mostly is coming through Lori Wallach, who's been very close to the negotiations, which is kind of a first, and then also through some of the other partners that we've been meeting with regularly and speaking with in D.C. I'm going to introduce you, if folks aren't familiar, to the Replace Nafta campaign, to our website, to some of the activities, really simple activities that we've got going on, and steps you can take to get more deeply involved. And the third point, I just want to send a few links over on the chat so that folks can leave the call having already done two steps that are small but very important. You can go to the next slide. So we're going to start with talking about the status of negotiations. Then I'll do a Q&A just on that and preface that with I will answer those questions as best I can. There is a lot of information that I probably won't be able to speak to as an expert, rather as a sort of secondhand witness to experts discussing these things, and then we'll talk about what we can do now. You can go to the next one. So the big thing, which might be shocking to some people and might be not shocking to other people, is that some of our trade agenda has been being discussed. And this is, like I said, to some people it's completely shocking. The main thing that's been being discussed is ISDS policies. And one of the big debates and fights inside of the NAFTA renegotiations was the fact that the U.S. was really pushing to take ISDS out. Why? We don't really know. I don't really know. What is known is that in those final meetings, Mexico and the U.S. had agreed generally on a position around ISDS, and Canada had not. And Canada was pushing back really hard, even though they've been the recipient of the most ISDS cases under NAFTA. And as we know, Bill laid out ISDS very, very well in his talk. The majority of ISDS cases tend to center around environmental concerns, land issues, pollution, pollution of water, things like pipelines. Obviously, as we know with Keystone XL, the ISDS case that never needed to come to fruition. But this was going on, and I think, from my personal perspective, yeah, it probably has to do with a protectionist, nationalist sort of agenda. It also happens to be this bizarre situation where this has been a central demand of labor, of the Replace NAFTA campaign, and of trade justice activism for since NAFTA's inception. Chapter 11, ISDS, these kinds of corporate tribunals. The one thing, you can go to the next part. Another big pushback that was happening inside of the renegotiations, which folks have probably read about, was the rules of origin on automobiles. So the U.S. position was really strict around pushing for a higher percentage on rules of origin, meaning the percentage of a car that has to be manufactured in one of the NAFTA countries to enjoy tariff-free status as it moves across markets. So that was the U.S.'s starting position was upwards of 75%. I know that, or it might have been upwards of 80%. I know it got talked down to 75%, and it was still being discussed when the negotiations just ended. The other part of the auto conversation that's important for folks to understand, which was surprising, I think, even to some of the folks from labor that I met with, was that the U.S. position was also pushing for a percentage, a pretty high percentage. I think it was like a 40%, saying that the total amount, what percentage of the total amount of an auto had to be made by workers making over $16 an hour. This was the provision that a lot of us said would have required Mexico to change their labor standards and wages in regards to auto workers. It makes sense. It doesn't make sense if you're thinking about it sheerly politically. Like, well, why would somebody who hates Mexicans want to raise Mexican wages? But it makes sense if you think about it as maybe we're right that it's a race to the bottom, and that if we want to protect wages in the United States, we have to protect wages elsewhere, right? As long as that pipeline exists to funnel jobs out, you can start at the bottom and raise those standards. And for whatever reasons it was happening, it was being discussed, and it was being discussed very aggressively, to the point where folks who were not comfortable with it at first had to come to the table about it, because it was something that the U.S. was not budging on. So you can go to the next slide. The other big thing that the U.S. hasn't been budging on, and they have maintained this, and this was the final, whatever straw on the camel's back, it seems like, in this recent round of talks, was the sunset clause. So USTR was very, very forceful that the U.S. wanted a 5-year sunset clause, meaning that NAFTA had to be re-agreed upon every 5 years by the 3 countries involved. And as I say in the slide, this would inject some democracy into NAFTA. I wanted to emphasize the some part. But what excited us about that was, and should excite us as activists, especially, I would say especially for folks who are in movements and in campaigns that are trying to address things that NAFTA's falling horribly short on, is that sunset clause does give a potential window to pry open in 5 years and push for some more progressive change that hasn't been won yet. It also, of course, could go the other way. So, that's one of the things about democracy that I'm sure we all understand very much right now. It can swing in both directions. But so this was those are the kind of the big things that were these. How do I say it? So those were like pieces of the progressive trade agenda that were utilized, by the Trump team because they want to get, I don't want to try to speak to the why, but what we do know is that these have been demands from progressive trade justice organizations for a long time and from labor, and they were being discussed and they were actually being fought over, and somehow it was the U.S. that was pushing it. And what we saw, and I'll go into this in the next part, what we saw in the pushback was that some of the people who really decorate themselves as, progressives and environmentalists in places like Canada were actually pushing back on things that would limit the power of some of their worst environmental and human rights abusers, like the mining and oil and gas corporations that are headquartered there. So the Sunset Clause, as I said, and folks probably read this, that was the famous conversation where Trudeau said, I was totally going to come down to the U.S. and make a good deal, and then Mike Pence called me, and we had this argument, and the argument that they had was about the Sunset Clause. Apparently Mike Pence said, don't bother coming down unless you guys are willing to agree on the Sunset Clause, and Trudeau said, we won't. No prime minister would ever agree to a NAFTA that had a sunset clause, and apparently that was the phone call. It's important for us, so you can go to the next slide here. So what's happening now, and Lori very directly said that this was going to happen, and I think a lot of folks in our office knew that this was going to happen, is we're now seeing the neoliberal pushback, and it's coming from Democrats and Republicans, and it's coming from lobbyists in different countries. It's coming through the corporate media, and it's very convincing, and it's very forceful. What it started with was our dear friend Paul Ryan. His first plan seemed to have been to set this ultimatum and say, I'm not going to let this NAFTA renegotiation move forward, and I'm not going to let it come into the House. As we know, there was big debates about what exactly the fast-track timeline looks like, and at what point things would have had to have been put legally onto paper for that to actually move forward before the elections. And so Paul Ryan used his position to basically say, I'm gonna prevent this from moving forward if it doesn't, if I don't have a NAFTA on paper by, I think it was May 17th was his deadline. As we know, that passed. Very little happened. There was a lot of pushback against him, and interestingly, progressive Democrats in Congress were circulating the word inside that actually they would support. They would fight to ensure that the political space is open for Lighthizer to continue the negotiations, and they said basically, we want a good deal, not a rush deal. Go ahead and do your thing, right? And so what Paul Ryan was trying to play on was the hope that the Trump team was going to get really worried that, the Republicans were getting angry at them, that they were failing to get a deal, and that, Trump is, the master of the deal, right? And so that this would kind of look bad. But folks from actually the progressive side actually fought to keep that political space open because they knew what Paul Ryan was trying to do, and they knew that there was still open discussions happening inside of the NAFTA talks that had space in them for us to push back. I want to stress real quick before I get too far into the neoliberal thing. There was tons of stuff, and Bill pointed out many of them. There's tons of stuff in the renegotiated NAFTA that were crap, right? That were falling far, far, far short. I think that's a big understatement. There's a lot of problematic stuff. What was different in this process from previous processes is that there was some attempt by the people negotiating it, specifically the U.S. trade representatives, to meet the demands, at least some of the demands of the progressive movement. And again, we can debate why that is, but it was happening, and it's been happening, and it's still happening. And there was progressive Democrats involved from the House involved in that process and involved in trying to shape and trying to push back. Given that the worst case scenario in our activism would have been a really quick deal. If Paul Ryan's first plan had worked out and they had just said, okay, whatever, because the deal that Trudeau said he was on his way to D.C. to negotiate was a deal that didn't have a sunset clause, that kept ISDS. I think, they were trying to call it like cows and cars, right? It was, and in reality, it's important for folks to understand there was no meeting. Trudeau wasn't going to come to a meeting. It was an idea he had that never came to fruition. He made it sound in the media like, oh, I was about to leave the house, to go to this meeting, and then no, there was no meeting. That's Trudeau playing his suave game. So the neoliberal pushback, here we are. Paul Ryan, that was step one. Step two seemed to be a further push through Trudeau, which is what I was just describing. This sort of, well, I was coming down, and they were just being unreasonable. And what's ironic in this case, and obviously Donald Trump is unreasonable, but what's funny in this case is that what the U.S. was being unreasonable about are actually reasonable demands. It was the sunset clause. That was the thing, and we should not forget that who the corporate lobby in Canada are that are behind Trudeau in this. The world's mining corporations. And obviously pipelines and oil and gas interests. So then we have the media, of course, and we knew this was going to come. I don't think we anticipated it to be such a wild storm of media. But, obviously the major newspapers that we read are owned by corporations who have an interest in neoliberal policies, so they're not very happy. It is really easy for them to come out and attack this because most of the other things that Donald Trump has done have been, really awful and bizarre and, inconsistent. So they were, it was a very simple story that they've been pushing, which is, and this goes along also with the tariffs is, oh my God, I can't believe this. This is insane. This is just like so crazy. But what they're not saying is that the policies that they actually support are, neoliberal capitalism as we've experienced it as the world's experienced it for many decades. So, it's sort of like, yeah, you got two teams fighting each other that both have horrible politics, and we're seeing it play out. But what's unfortunate, and this is only going to get worse now that we have the Koch brothers putting themselves into this, also pushing back against some of the things that were getting renegotiated because they can't handle the idea that that ISDS is going to be removed from a NAFTA, that they might open the process up with the sunset clause a little bit to allow more changes to happen. When you've got Trudeau, the sort of iconic Canadian liberal, and he's playing on the same team with the Koch brothers and Paul Ryan and and Alec, right? It's a pretty bizarre situation. So yeah, I've already gone over Trudeau. So I'll jump real quick. I also want to speak about the G7 because that's the next stage of the neoliberal pushback. And I think Lori wrote a very short but very concise and pointed piece that we published on our blog, on the Global Trade Watch blog on Friday, which was basically just saying, look, here's the G7, the global representatives of the neoliberal order, and they're going to unite together to, quite easily make Trump look like he's being absurd with the tariffs. And inside of that, they're really hungry for, the neoliberal trade policies. They're hungry for the TPP style agreements to be made, and they're really worried about if if the U.S., for whatever reasons it is, were able to get a renegotiated NAFTA that dropped ISDS, that would set a precedent. And they're worried about that precedent being set. I think that goes without saying. So, let's see what the next slide is. So, again, as I said, everything I just said could sound very easily like, why are you guys supporting Trump? Why are you supporting Trump's agenda? And what we've been saying is actually Trump, the things I talked about, just now, the ending ISDS, the sunset clause, that's not Trump's agenda. That's been actually our agenda for a long time. It's not our complete agenda, but it's part of our agenda. So it's not Trump's agenda. And that's why there's been a lot of progressive Democrats in Congress who've been supporting this. And those are folks we've been working with, we've been talking to, and they've been pushing back because they've been seeing the process, and they've been seeing the corporate-backed politicians and the real serious neoliberals coming out of the woodwork, stretching their hands across the aisle, in a great show of neoliberal unity to come out and try to shut this down before it gets anywhere. I want to say from a personal perspective how I see the moment that we're in, and this is how I've been seeing it for a while, and this is going to parlay us into talking about actions. Is that, Trump opened the box, right? Like he opened the box, and the box is open now. And that's for us too. So we need to not be so overwhelmed by, the shit show that we're not taking effective action. And it's a really hard thing to talk about, but I really believe that, and I think it's very obvious from anything you can read about the Trump administration, that it's not a well-oiled machine. It's not the Bush administration. It's not the Obama administration. It's not a unified force. It's a really strange conglomeration of what seems like a lot of different people's ideas and strategies bouncing sometimes violently off of one another. And what that means is that there's political space open for us to move into and to take advantage of. And there's the possibility that, that Lighthizer isn't able to get, for instance, Canada back to the table in any real way, and that this goes it flickers out. Who's going to enter that space? Who's going to take up the discussion about NAFTA? And we need to make sure, I think our number one job moving forward, and it's been our number one job, is to make sure that NAFTA is an unignorable issue, that renegotiating NAFTA, doing away with NAFTA, changing NAFTA is an unignorable issue. It has to be addressed by people running for office. It has to be addressed by people who've won office, and it should be being addressed by organizations that, have good values. And we need to really fight for it. We need to really push for it. And there's no point in pushing for it if we think there's no space open. And we believe, and I believe, that there is space open. It's hard to see it. It's there. With that, I think I really want to point out that, what, as Bill touched on, especially on the environmental tip, but also on, there's a bunch of other stuff that I hope folks will be discussing in future calls and probably have discussed in past calls is, other issues like access to medicine and issues around intellectual property and a lot of stuff that the, current NAFTA was far from anything that anyone could get excited about. So what we're doing right now, you can go to the next slide now. Here's some really basic stuff that we're doing. We have our general petition, and if somebody wants to actually write that link up, I can try, but I'm a little unfamiliar with this. We have our general Replace NAFTA petition, which will go out to your member of Congress. Here we are. I've got it right here. And that's something really easy that folks can do right now. It'll automate it. You type in your information, it'll automatically send it to the right folks. That's been something we've had for a while. But we just did a more recent one, which I want to put in front of you all, which is so as people might know, the American Legislative Exchange Council put out, they were trying to gather signatures from state legislators at the local level, trying to support, ISDS policies and stuff like this. So we thought, let's get ahead of them and gather more of them. So far, we started this about 2 weeks ago. It gives your state legislator the chance to also participate in the discussion. And I know I was out in Michigan last weekend, and I was talking to a guy named Yusuf Rabhi, who's a state legislator in Michigan in the Ann Arbor area, and he's been really outspoken about Nafta. Obviously, he's a Michigan representative, but I asked him how do you see you as a state legislator kind of playing into the into a tri-national trade issue? And he said, well, trade is a local issue. The cost of food is a local issue, and we're just as affected by it as everybody else. So we need to look at how our economies function locally, and that's a transnational issue, and it's an international issue. So I thought that was a really pointed thing for him to say. So this gives people like him a chance to let their supporters know that they're speaking out and that they're putting their words to action, at least on paper here. And this is part of both of these things. I would say are part of building up our arsenal right now. So obviously a petition from state legislators is not going to change the course of NAFTA renegotiations, but it's one extra thing to have in our pocket, to present to people when we're talking about some of these things. And that state legislator letter is specifically about ISDS, pushing really hard on that. So we've already got about 200 state legislators signed on. And we've sent, I think, between our two lists, I think they've sent 20,000 letters to their state representatives. So that's pretty cool. We've got all this merch laying around the office that we're trying to get rid of. It's free. We'll send it to you if you want to do any campaigning with it. If you want to, for folks who are newer to the Replace NAFTA campaign, right now, especially in these time periods where, I know that any of you who've talked to me on the phone recently, ironically, the first month of my position has been just so absolutely bizarre and chaotic, and people want to know what the hell's going on, and I think I do too. But what I do know is that in moments like this, when we are uncertain of the direction and the time frame that we're working with, and we know that there's a lot of bad stuff that we have to fight against, and we know that there's some good stuff that we need to protect. So we want to hold the space, and we want to open more of the space up. And, building public awareness is always important as we move into the election cycle. And we want to, if we're keeping that first goal, as I said, making Replace NAFTA unignorable, this is one simple way, get some of this stuff, table at your farmer's market, table at any sort of event you can get into. I know there's been folks in Indiana and Massachusetts and Connecticut who've been writing sample, suggested platforms at the Democratic committee, at the Democratic conventions there, pushing for, fair and decent trade policies to be written in this time period. Those are all, and they've been tabling at some of those conventions, and these, that stuff can just help you out. We also have, you can go to the next slide, we also have tons of resources to send people for free. We have like an action kit, we have postcards that you can get people to sign that also put folks into our contact system. We have, a lot of information sheets we can send you. We have state-by-state sheets that we can send out. You can also print them off of our website. So that is all stuff that we're totally capable of getting to you quite quickly, and then you can get that out to folks in your area. Another thing that you can be doing right now, I think this is one of the most important things. We're up against, as I said earlier, we're not just like, corporate Democrat media, but also the Koch brothers, kind of the amazing collaborative effort. But it's important for us to be writing letters to the editor to combat the rhetoric, also to put out there what's not being discussed, to use it as a political teaching moment, but also to use it as a moment where, look, there is this right-wing populist thing happening all over the U.S., all over Europe, and elsewhere. And if you look at what some of the sort of far-right parties in Europe talk about, a big thing they talk about is the oppression of the IMF on their countries. In Italy and Greece are two of the biggest examples, but also Spain and also across in Eastern Europe. So it's weird, right? It's definitely weird, and it's definitely a moment where the topics are being discussed, the acronyms that we've long discussed are in the public, and when was the last time that NAFTA was talked about so much in the media? We could easily sit back overwhelmed and say, damn, the neoliberals are completely winning the debate, and they're gonna breed some sort of horrible Frankenstein trade agreement of like the worst of nationalism and the worst of neoliberalism. But another thing we could be doing is saying, you know what, it's out there, people are talking about it, let's try to make our voice as loud as we can. A really simple way is to do letters to the editor. Much more complicated way is to try to figure out how to combat a group like the Koch brothers in the media right now around these issues, which is really difficult. But you live somewhere, you might have a local paper that still prints original material, and if you do, you should try to write a letter to the editor. If you want any help with that letter, you can feel free, ignore that email address on the bottom there, just get in touch with me directly it's rharvey@replacenafta.org, and I will gladly help with any part of your op-ed or your letter to the editor. Sorry, I'm typing as I'm talking here. You can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Thank you. I kind of already talked about this, but just you can see the image there. We also have stickers. We have buttons. Those are a bunch of our fact sheets and stuff like that. We've got a lot of mobilizing to do. And as we mentioned earlier, just because there's 5 good things in the NAFTA renegotiations doesn't mean that we stop at those. There's a lot of stuff we need to push on, and we have a lot of mobilizing to do. So I really encourage you to contact me, get us to send you out a box of material that you can hand out and use. You can use that. Part of the point of handing out an information sheet is to inform somebody about the information that's on the sheet. A much more important aspect of doing that is to meet people, get their contact information, build with them, have a short conversation, you get a sense of where they are at, and then you can contact them a short time later and say, hey, I wanted to follow up with you about that. That's how we start organizing. And that's how we start building local efforts like some folks have built in different parts of the country around trade justice. And that's going to be a big part of my job as I move forward, is going to be getting more of that happening and figuring out like the best and the smartest and the most creative ways to interface with people and to talk with them about trade. So you can go to the next slide. And this is my little, ignore the last 2. I think that was a copy and paste error on my part. But there's kind of 4 steps that we've set out for our member of Congress engagement. The first one is to engage with them in some way. That's for us, right? Try to get a meeting with your member of Congress. Try to get them on the phone if you need to, and you probably should. Try to set up a delegation. Feel free to get in touch with me, and I can help you put your delegation together. We can get folks in your community and who are in your district who have, a foot in the door, or might be listened to more than others, or folks who have stories that need to be listened to and won't be listened to. Putting together a delegation can be a really good idea. If your member of Congress is friendly and you think they're an ally, then the delegation can be really effective. If they're not budging, you can always make that delegation public and use a little pressure in it. We have to be strategic and understand who we're working with. So the next step, and this is sort of step one on the congressperson's part, is we want to get an answer from them, right? There is no NAFTA renegotiation document, and that's one of the biggest problems, as we said earlier, right? It's behind closed doors, it's a secret thing, as they've always been. But what we can get is we can get members of Congress to say what their red lines are. What would you vote on a renegotiated NAFTA if it had X, Y, and Z removed or X, Y, and Z added? We want to get folks on record. We want to know who is going to stick their neck out and stand on the right side of this and who's not. The next step for that person, if they are, if they say, you know what, I'm all about your agenda, I want to do this, I want, a different kind of trade agreement that works for people and planet, that raises labor standards and X, Y, and Z, then say it loud, make it public, write a statement, sign on to an open letter, become an ally who actually shows up and speaks when we need it, become somebody who writes, who writes, for instance, a letter to the editor or whatnot. Second stage of that is join a whip team, become somebody who's contacting other representatives and pressuring them. Become one of the folks that we have on the inside who've been really, really pushing. And the fourth one is do what you say. And I know for some politicians this is a very hard one. And for us as activists, it's very important that we understand that getting somebody's commitment isn't good enough unless they actually follow through with it. And for me as an organizer, I think we need to also think about and be really creative about we can't just rest because somebody said they'll do the right thing. We don't rest until they've done the right thing. And we need to make sure that we figure out structures in our organizing that ensure that person feels like there's no way they can turn back and not commit, right? It's in the public. We've gotten them on record. We've gotten them to do something publicly. And we've made it a situation where they kind of have to do it or they're shooting themselves in the foot. You can go to the next one. So I posted those links. I hope folks saw them and followed them. Just put your info in, and you'll also be put onto make sure you keep the box clicked that we can follow up with you, because we'll be sending a lot of stuff out, both updates and action alerts. And as I move forward, and again, thank you all for having me and for kind of welcoming me into this circle. As I said earlier, I'm only a month into doing this, but I've been involved in this movement for about 20 years. I was a Seattle boomer, as I like to say, and I'm going to be trying to come up with some really creative and strategic ideas moving forward to make sure that this is an unignorable issue.
It's really great, Brian.
You can go to the next slide. I think I'm done.
Oh, yeah, we got.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Oh, that was really good. I'm really, really impressed with the way you talked about it. Thank you so much. So, anybody with a question for Ryan, press *6, and when prompted, press 1. I know it's very difficult right now because the Democrats hate Trump so much that I think the feeling is just go against anything that Trump is trying to do, and there may be some good things that we might be able to get out of this trade agreement. Not that we don't like Trump, but so it's a really difficult time, especially during an election year. So I wonder if you might have a comment about that, Ryan, while people are getting in the queue.
Yeah, I mean, look, like, what's bizarre is that Trump's is meeting right now with North Korea, right? And I don't think anyone's been able to make sense of that. And so, a metaphor I like to make is, if for whatever reason whatever his rationale is, and I'm not even going to attempt to understand it because I've tried it and I just can't wrap my head around it, but, what if somehow out of this, the DMZ was actually demilitarized, and there was some sort of peace accord, and Trump was in the middle of it somehow by circumstance or because he actually did something. Would we condemn that because it's Trump, or would people say like, well, I mean, it's obviously a good thing. It needed to happen. It's a shame that it took this long. It's a shame that past politicians, especially ones who claim to be progressive, didn't seem to be able to look this issue in the eye and do the right thing. Part of me is like, look, and I can't speak on behalf of my organization here, but, one of the reasons that this is happening is because NAFTA has been horrible. It's been horrible for everyone except corporations. So it's not just, of course, like our decades of activism and rabble-rousing have had a lot of effect on the rhetoric and an effect on people finding out about this. But, it's devastated so many people. And I think that my assumption is that Trump is trying to get those people behind him. And he wants to get those votes, I mean, it's no secret that he won the election in no small part because he talked about, getting rid of NAFTA. And he got a lot of votes from folks in the hardest hit parts of NAFTA country in the U.S. So it ain't a secret. And I think he wants to have those people behind him. And he knows that especially the Clinton Democrats, those folks aren't going to, they're not trying to hear that anymore, especially after the economic crisis, I think that's probably the simplified version of it. I don't really think of Trump as being a grand, like a Henry Kissinger or something, with some grand evil vision of the world. I think it's a lot, unfortunately, I mean, not saying Henry Kissinger is fortunate, but in terms of our understanding of what's going to happen next, I think it's much simpler and stranger than all of that. So, but yeah, and I think also,
but it's hard for an organizer, it's hard in the position where you generally try to get, Democrats to do the right thing, I mean, not that we don't try to get Republicans to also, but a lot of us are used to working with the Democrats, and it makes for a very sticky situation right now.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard to organize people with the level of like pro neoliberal rhetoric that's coming out right now, right? Like I've seen people that are friends of mine posting things on Facebook being like, acting as if steel tariffs are like we had attacked, like we had invaded Canada or something, and they probably don't realize because they're just being fed the simple narrative that, Trump's a maniac, so tariffs are bad. And I'm not saying the tariffs are like, obviously it's not just tariffs, it's tariffs with like the bizarre justification of national security, and it's obviously like super problematic and weird, but, tariffs are not, the end of the world, and it's probably a short-term bargaining strategy on his part. And as we were talking about in the office the other day, it's ironic that, tariffs are bad for the corporate media when they're put onto Europe or the U.S., but when the U.S. put the exact same tariffs for steel and aluminum at the same percentage on South Africa a month ago, there wasn't a single article written about it in the American press. But there was tons of articles in the South African press about it, but none in the U.S. So of course there's hypocrisy in it, but it's going to be really hard to come out on top.
There are disagreements from the left about the tariffs also, like, there being, like with respect to now, Canada's dairy and all that sort of thing. Yeah. But the big thing for me is, how do we get our point across? to people that have been our allies, and, they may sway in another direction just to get votes. That's a little scary to me. So I guess that's the thing, is to refine our message. So I think what we'll do is open the queue now. So we've got a couple of questions in there, if you're tired of listening to me.
Okay, our first question comes from caller at area code 815. Your line is open.
Okay, I have to admit I'm a bit confused, because when Bill spoke, he said all these things that might happen. Might they happen if we renegotiate it? So the whole idea here is to, no, I don't know. I'm not sure. The message to me is not clear. It's like mixed. Do we want to negotiate, or do we not want to negotiate? And under what circumstances would all the things that Bill mentioned come into play, that could come into play? I realize he's not sure, but okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that would be more of a question for Bill, but what I can say for sure is that we don't know. There is no agreement. There is no, it obviously has come to, how long the sort of standstill lasts, we don't know, but obviously right now I don't think there's a lot of, happy discussions happening in the NAFTA circle. But so all we know from our part is what we've heard from folks who've been inside of the negotiation, based on kind of their consultation with some folks who represent the nonprofit and labor sector. Whether those things actually make it to the final agreement, we don't know. And that's like we all said, that's one of the really problematic things about this process, of the many, is that it's all secret. So we just know what we know from folks who've been inside. What I think my larger point is that we can know, I don't know, it sounds ambitious, but we can know what's going to be inside of it based on what we make unignorable issues. And that's going to be what we're going to be able to get at this point. So, yeah. We have educated guesses.
We also do know what's already in the NAFTA. We know that there is an ISDS in there, and it's been in there for 25 years. So that's something that we do know. So
and we know what was going to be in the TPP. That's what we have to work with. How different a renegotiated NAFTA would be from the TPP is a subject, I think, of really great debate, because there's so many. Because A, you're dealing with Donald Trump, and B, you're dealing with a bunch of ideas that have come out since then that say they're going to be different. So, yeah.
The one thing that Bill said that is definitely true is that Donald Trump and his trade team, they don't seem to really give very much credence to climate change or environmental protections. So, and with all of their domestic appointees, I think, that's what we do know, and that's why it's so important to, to try to get rid of ISDS and, to try to understand more about the regulatory review, which, we've read about it, but we haven't really seen it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and as an organizer, that's one of the hardest things. I'm not sure how old folks on the call are, but I wonder if any of you were involved in trying to stop the Vietnam War. But so Richard Nixon really wanted the Vietnam War, but people went and tried to stop it. So I think that there's we're not always going to be pushing for things that the person who has the power agrees with us on, and I think that there's a lot of fights that have to happen under Trump, and they're not going to come easy, and they're not going to be, they're not going to be based on a goodwill gesture from the people in power. Yes.
Okay, we have one more question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Harriet.
Okay. Yeah, do you all at Global Trade Watch, Ryan, do you all talk about the regulatory review? Because we don't see that very much in anything.
I haven't, but again, I'm so new and things have been so chaotic.
Okay, I was just wondering.
So I couldn't answer that well.
The TTIP and the TPP, my understanding is they both had, a regulatory coherence or harmonization chapters. And I was just wondering, we don't hear it very much, discussed very much. So I just didn't know what your understanding is about that.
I'm going to put that on my list of things to figure out on Monday.
Okay, thank you. Okay, go ahead, Carrie. I'm sorry. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that we do have one more question in the queue and several in the chat box. So let's get our next caller on the line, though. Area code 518, your line is open.
Hi, and yes, I was involved in trying to stop the Vietnam War. It's where I got my feet wet. But anyway, I have heard organizing the left compared to herding cats. But I'm thinking people had a lot of different reasons for voting for Trump. Okay? Many different reasons. And I have been thinking that it would be good to organize get-togethers of people who did and who didn't vote for Trump, to sit down over pizza or whatever, because food is a great social organizer, lubricant. Anyway, to look for common ground, to explore what we actually hope for that led to that decision, to whatever decision we made about who to vote for. So what do we hope for? How can we work together to make that happen? And stopping the secrecy is, as you said, a big piece of the puzzle. And with people from all over the political spectrum working together on stopping the secrecy, I think we have a much better chance. So that's it.
Thanks, Mary Alice.
Sure.
Did you have a question, or was that?
Yeah, that was my question. Can we organize get-togethers of people who did and who did not vote for Trump to look for common ground and explore what we actually are hoping for?
I think that even more than get-togethers, I think what we have to be thinking about and talking about is how do we build, and obviously I'm not particularly interested in working with all of the Trump voters, but yeah, there's a lot of folks who do a lot of things for a lot of different reasons, and I think that more than just those conversations, I think conversations happen best when they're in a larger context, and I think that we need to figure out how to build movements that are addressing like the real concerns that people have in their lives within reason. Obviously, I mean, I think that if someone's concern is that they don't like their neighbor because of the color of their skin, then we have a problem. But if their concern is that they're afraid about their job, if their concern is that their water is poison, then we've got to figure out how to go and have those conversations there and build that larger analysis. I mean, what's so shocking is that all across the Western world, we're seeing the sort of return of quote anti-globalization, and it's on the right wing's term, and they've just come out on top, dominating the debate about it the way we did, at the end of the 90s. And unfortunately, so much of their perspective and so much of the sort of information that they put out comes from just, conspiratorial blogs and these, sort of just this really grand, paranoia about like the global order and secret societies and all these weird things like this. Whereas I think what we focus on is non-secret cabals of corporate power that are obvious and open about what they do. They're not meeting in the woods at night. They're meeting in a hotel in D.C. and their agenda is partially public. And they're very open about what they do because they believe in it. It has an economic theory that drives it, that's written about and taught in schools, and it has a history that people all over the world have experienced and talked about. So and I'm not saying it's easy because I've tried it with people I know personally, and it's very hard. But we have to figure out how do we build like political campaigns in which we can tell our story about those same issues in a way that makes more sense than people who believe in things like Pizzagate. How can we just have that basic story saying like, well, it's actually really simple. There's a ton of corporations that have huge amounts of money invested in these types of trade agreements, and they push them, and they push people into power who support them. And the net result is that a lot of folks lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and more corporate wealth is generated. It's, it doesn't seem that difficult.
Yeah, and then they keep us fighting among ourselves about the symptoms of the disease. Yeah, I know. We just have to get beyond the partisanship. That's what somehow needs to happen.
Well, and I think what the question also addresses is also, we need to all remember, the Trump years are crazy, but the same election that brought us Trump also brought us almost President Bernie Sanders, and a crazy progressive left wing. I mean, the term socialism is just normal now. You couldn't go around talking about that stuff 6 years ago.
That's right.
We're also winning. Our broader ideas about the world are also winning in a lot of social circles with a lot of people. What we don't have right now is organization. We're not well organized. I don't think the Trump people are well organized either. I think they just, I like to use a soccer metaphor because I'm a soccer player, which is, they're an unorganized team that managed to get the ball, and they have the ball, but they're not actually a really strong team, and we can also get the ball, and I think that's what the fight for right now is, like, who can get the ball. But that said, I think we need to keep in mind, hope drives revolutions, hope drives movements. People know how bad things are. What we need to figure out is we need to figure out things that work, that attract people, because people want results and they want to move forward. So that's where I'm at.
Well, we loved hearing you tonight. You were just wonderful, Ryan.
Thanks.
We look forward to hearing from you again. And we're going to move on now. You're welcome to participate in the queue for the last 5 minutes or however. I don't even think it's going to be 5 more minutes. But thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you all.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our next webinar. This will be the last webinar of the summer. We are excited to announce that July 15th, it's going to be all about our friends and our fellow workers in Mexico. The updates after the July election, July 1st, they're having their election, and hopefully we'll have a good result with the current front runner, Andre Manuel Lopez Obrador. Our speakers will be Manuel Perez Rocha. He's an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and Hector de la Cueva. He is the founder and a researcher for the Center of Labor Research and Trade Union Advisory in Mexico. We're really looking forward to talking about the implications for labor rights, the election results implications, and much, much more. Our economy, what we really need to understand, is really tied to Mexico, our labor, our wages. And when Mexico's people suffer, we suffer right along with them. So please join us for that. That will be our last webinar of the summer until later on in September. You can also access all of our videos by our wonderful Carrie, who is also running the call board tonight. I don't think I could manage that. She takes the audio and the visuals, and she makes YouTube videos. And to access all of those, you can go to tradejustice.net/webinar vids, and you can find pretty much all of our videos on there. We think Carrie's a genius. So, and also, we could use your help. We would love it if you would join our Wednesday night planning calls. You'd probably like to volunteer with us. We would love to have you. There's lots of roles to be filled. They're known and yet to be discovered. You can help plan. You can help organize and promote and run our webinars even if you like. You can do speaker outreach and come up with ideas and brainstorm for topics and speakers. And then last but not least, we would appreciate a tiny donation tossed into the PayPal kitty to help us pay our expenses. To do that, go to tradejustice.net/TJA donate and give us a few dollars. Don't even have to hit the $5 mark. Just a few dollars under the Wetlands Activism Collective umbrella. You'll see it's at tradejustice.net. /TJA donate. Okay, and finally, we want to thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. We understand there are lots of other places that you could be on your Sunday night, so we are actually very grateful, and we're honored that you chose to spend your time with us. So thank you all so much, and have a good night, and good night from the Trade Justice Alliance team. Thank you.
Thanks, Harriet.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
Thanks,
everybody.
We're here. Thank you. Thanks, Bill, and thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you, Bill.
Those were terrific talks. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our participants. Thank you.